Moving west, New York newspaper editor John O'Sullivan coined the term manifest destiny in 1845 to describe the United States' aggressive westward expansion. The idea of manifest destiny included the belief that the United States had a God given mission to extend its control from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean and to bring American Christianity, capitalism, democracy, and culture there. Americans used this idea intent to justify aggressive actions against Mexico, British Canada, and many Native American nations that lived in the West. Manifest Destiny hid the more negative aspects of American expansion, including the extension of slavery. Overcrowded east, by the early 1800s, land was scarce in the east, especially New England, and land was more productive and expensive in the middle Atlantic states. In the South, planters controlled the best lands. Facing limited opportunities, the young and the poor in rural East had strong incentives to move west where land was cheap and fertile. The population growth in the period of 1800 and 1850 saw the national base population increase by almost 5 times. Through purchase, Louisiana and Florida, and conquest, various Native American tribes, the land area of the nation more than tripled. Large families became the norm in rural society, and during the years of the Jeffersonian Republicans, the government land policies attempted to aid Americans who wished to become freeholders. Public land prices would fall between 1800 and 1830. The various draws between 1841 and 1867, hundreds of thousands of people took overland trails to California or Oregon, while others settled in regions such as Colorado, Texas, and Arkansas. A small number traveled by sea from the east coast of the United States to California around the southern tip of South America. The main factor that tended to drive people to move to California was the discovery of gold there in 1848. However, other sorts of opportunities, fertile farmland, and the sense of escape from life in the East were also common factors. Plains Indians, more than 325,000 Native Americans, over 200 linguistically, cultural, religiously, and governmentally diverse nations lived in the lands west of the Mississippi River in 1840. The movement of American migrants across the lands and their efforts of settlers, federal officials, and U.S. military to control Native Americans led to conflict that increasingly undermined Native American cultures and leadership. The Great American Desert was referred to in 1830s United States that had set aside land west of the Mississippi River for displaced Native Americans. Whites had originally been reluctant to settle on the western plains because they believed the region had little potential for agriculture. The Sioux were the dominant power on the northern and central Great Plains. The other two major tribes were the Crow and the Arapahoes, and trade in buffalo hides increased in the early 1800s. Epidemic diseases helped the Sioux expansion since the nomadic Sioux were less susceptible to disease than the sedentary agricultural peoples. The differences in fighting of war existed between whites. The Plains Indians fought to show honor rather than killing as many enemies as possible. The Great Migration.
Nice girl, but about as sharp as a sack of wet mine.
Between the 1840s and early 1850s, about 150,000 Americans made their overland trip from Missouri to Oregon, Utah, and California. Under an 1818 treaty, an agreement on the Oregon Territory was administered jointly by the United States and Great Britain. News of the richness of the soil in the area started the rush of settlers there, which made joint occupation even more difficult. Life on the overland trails could be monotonous and tiring. The starting point was Independence, Missouri. Most families traveled on foot and their goods in prairie schooners. The journey was long, usually ranging from 5 to 6 months, and included a variety of climates and weather patterns. In addition, pioneers faced the threat of disease, broken wagons, or dead livestock. Despite these hardships, many made the journey, often with Indian guides and advisors. They sometimes traded with Indian traders or mountain men or at trading posts along the way. The overland immigration to the Trans-Mississippi West reached its peak in 1852, and the greatest cause of the 5,000 deaths that occurred on the Oregon Trail was disease. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 was the first attempt to draw boundaries to contain the Plains Indians. The results of the Fort Laramie Treaty, including only a brief standoff between the Sioux and the United States government. The Native Americans guaranteed safe passage for settlers on the Oregon Trail and allowed roads and forts to be built in their territories in return for promises of annuity in the amount of 50 trails west. As settlers continued the American tradition of moving to the new uncultivated land, they followed in the paths laid out for them by trail breakers, early pioneers who had made the same journey, who usually followed trails or paths used by Indians following animal paths for seasonal migration. In the 1840s, as the number of American migrants across the overland trails increased, they crossed lands claimed and used by Native Americans of the Plains, Pacific Northwest, and other regions. The War for Texas Independence. Mexico tried to curb immigration from the United States, but failed to halt the influx of Anglo-Americans into Texas. Relations broke down between Texas and the Anglo-Texican delegates from the 59 Texian towns met in Washington on the Brazos on March 2, 1836, and declared that they were independent from Mexico and had formed the Republic of Texas. They also wrote a constitution by their country and named Sam Houston the commander-in-chief of the newly formed army. In an effort to put down the Texas Rebellion, the president of Mexico, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, led an army into Texas and defeated forces in San Antonio at the Spanish mission known as the Alamo. The Alamo was under the command of Colonel William Travis. Jim Bowie, the man you see pictured on the right, was sent to the Alamo to take the artillery, but was convinced that it could be defended. Squabbles with Travis, volunteers comprised much of the garrison, and they were unwilling to accept Travis as their leader. Bowie would later fall ill and bedridden, and Bowie would refuse to leave. Davy Crockett, the one pictured to the left of what you see, was a legendary frontiersman, sharpshooter, bear hunter, and storyteller. As a member of Congress, when he did not get reelected, he said they might as well all go to hell. I'm going to Texas. Crockett and his Tennessee volunteers would arrive at the Alamo. The siege. Santa Anna arrived demanding a surrender. Travis answered with a firing from the cannon. 187 Texians would hold out for 13 days against 3,000 Mexican regulars. On March 5th, Travis received a message that there would be no reinforcements arriving from Sam Houston. They were on their own. Travis, knowing what the final outcome would be, drew a line in the sand and asked who would remain with him to fight and defend the Alamo. All but one crossed the line. Bowie had to be carried over on a stretcher. On March 6, 1836, at 4 o'clock in the morning, Santa Anna would finally make his final attacks. All the defenders of the Alamo would perish, along with 600 Mexicans. 7 defenders had survived, captured, and were hacked to death. Joe, who was Travis's ex-slave, had freed him before the fateful 9th, but he decided as a free man that he would stay and fight. Remember the Alamo would become the battle cry of the Texas Revolution. The Battle of San Jacinto, April 21st, 1836. The runaway scrape on March 13th, Susanna Dickinson and Joe brought news of the Alamo garrison that had been defeated by the Mexican army and was marching towards the Texian settlement. A hastily convened council of war voted to evacuate the area and retreat. Led by General Sam Houston, the Texian army engaged and defeated General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna in a fight that lasted just 18 minutes. Now, throughout the night, Mexican troops worked to fortify their camp. creating breastworks out of everything that they could find, including saddles and brush. At 9 a.m. on April 21st, Costs arrived with 540 reinforcements, bringing the Mexican force to 1,200 men, which outnumbered the Texians. Costa's men were raw recruits rather than experienced soldiers, and they had marched steadily for more than 24 hours with no rest, no food. As the morning wore on, with no Texian attack, Mexican officers lowered their guard. By afternoon, Santa Anna had given permission for Costa's men to sleep. His own tired troops also took advantage of the time to rest, the siesta, eat, and bathe. Not long after the Mexican reinforcements arrived, Houston ordered Smith to destroy Vince's Bridge 5 miles away to slow down any further Mexican reinforcements. At 4 p.m., the Texians had been creeping quietly through the tall grass, pulling the cannon behind them. Cannon fired at 4:30, beginning the Battle of San Jacinto. After a single volley, Texians broke ranks and swarmed over the Mexican breastworks to engage in hand-to-hand combat. Mexican soldiers were taken by surprise. Santa Anna, Castrillon, and Almonte yelled off in conflicting orders, attempting to organize their men into some form of defense. Within 18 minutes, Mexican soldiers abandoned their campsite and fled for their lives. The killing lasted for hours. Many Mexican soldiers retreated through the marsh to Peggy Lake. Texian riflemen stationed themselves on the banks and shot at anything that moved. Many Texian officers, including Houston and Rusk, attempted to stop the slaughter, but they were unable to gain control of their men. The Texians continued to chant, "Remember the Alamo! Remember Goliad!" While fighting, Mexican infantry yelled, "Mi no Alamo!" and begged for mercy to no avail. And what historian Davis would call one of the most one-sided victories in history, 650 Mexican soldiers were killed and 300 captured. 11 Texians died, with 30 others, including Houston, being wounded. And then Santa Anna was captured. He was captured wearing a private's uniform. None of the Texians recognized him, but when he was brought into the camp, the Mexican soldiers stood up and saluted the general. With the Oregon Territory settled and Britain out of the way, Polk could now concentrate on California. After the joint resolution for annexing Texas passed, Mexico had severed diplomatic relations with the U.S. and increased its armed forces to resist annexation. Major grievances included boundary disagreements. Mexico insisted that the Nueces River was the real southwestern boundary of Texas, which was north of the Rio Grande. Stop payments. In 1843, Mexico halted payments of more than $2 million in damages to U.S. nationals. The status of California. Mexico had ordered the expulsion of all U.S. settlers, an action believed encouraged by the British. The Slidell Mission. Early in August of 1845, after learning that Mexico desired to resume diplomatic relations, the U.S. government sent Special Envoy John Slidell to Mexico on a secret mission to explore purchasing Upper California and New Mexico and to adjust the boundary from the mouth of the Rio Grande along the 32nd parallel at a price of $15 to $40 million. After the United States withdrew its naval squadron off Veracruz, negotiations started. Although Mexico wanted to only discuss the boundary of Texas, Slidell was authorized to offer $5 million for New Mexico and $25 million for California and to resume Mexican debts to U.S. nationals, if Mexico would accept the Rio Grande as the boundary of Texas. Because the Slidell mission desired to discuss extraneous issues, Mexico refused to receive him on technical reasons. Well, the United States Senate had not yet to confirm him. Picking a fight. General Mariano Paredes, upon learning his refusal to receive Slidell, General Zachary Taylor was ordered to the Rio Grande as a result of even considering discussing the Texas boundary. President Jose J. Herrera's government was overthrown by General Mariano Paredes, who reaffirmed Mexico's claim to Texas up to the Sabine River. This inflexible attitude was reported to Washington by Slidell, who then left Mexico and returned to the United States in March of 1846. Polk dispatched troops to the U.S.-Mexican border to protect the new American citizens. However, the border was different for the two sides. Mexico considered the border farther north than the Rio Grande, the Nueces River, which was accepted by Texas and the United States. General Zachary Lee Taylor, commander of U.S. forces in the Southwest, was headquartered in Fort Jessup, Louisiana, was put on alert in May and ordered to proceed to the area of the Rio Grande River. Taylor established his base in the south bank of the Nueces, to which was gathered about 3,500 troops, or about half the United States Army. In January of 1846, Taylor was ordered to advance to the left bank of the Rio Grande. The second in command, General William J. Worth, proceeded to the Rio Grande north of Matamoros, facing a Mexican force of 5,700. General Pedro de Ampudia warned Taylor on April 25, 1846, that the United States must pull back to the Nueces or arms, and arms alone must decide the question. Refusing to comply, Taylor requested U.S. naval forces blockade the mouth of the Rio Grande. Captain Seth B. Thornton and two dragoon companies were sent to investigate upriver, rode into an ambush, and his 80-man force was quickly overwhelmed by Torreon's 1,600, resulting in 11 of Thornton's men being killed and 6 wounded, while the rest were taken prisoner, including Captain Thornton. When news arrived of the skirmish between Mexican and American forces near Matamoros, Polk asked Congress for a declaration of war on May 11, 1846, asserting that the United States had legitimate claims to the area south of the Nueces. Polk's message claimed that the American blood had been spilt on American soil, and after serious debate, the House passed the declaration of war 174 to 14, being opposed by Northern representatives, and the Senate passed it 40 to 2, opposed by 2 Whigs, with 3 abstentions, including John C. Calhoun. Lincoln's Spot Resolution. A new congressman from Illinois offered a resolution which asked on what spot was U.S. blood spilled. Whig Representative Garrett Davis asserted that Polk began this war. The House rejected the resolution 97 to 27. An amendment that stated that the declaration of war was not support for sending troops to Rio Grande in the first place. The appropriations bill called for 50,000 volunteers, $10 million appropriation, and was opposed by 67 Whigs. Road to victory. Scott defeated Santa Anna's men at Cerro Gordo on April 18th, took Jalapa on April 19th, and Puebla on 15th of May. After taking Contreras and Churubusco, Santa Anna asked for an armistice on August 20th, 1847. The armistice ended on September 7th, and the following day Scott took Molino del Rey. Scott would march victorious into Mexico City on September 13th through the 14th. The Treaty of Guadalupe-Hidalgo would officially end the Mexican War. The land ceded to the United States of Mexico in the treaty on February 2, 1848. It was signed by U.S. envoy Nicholas Trist, and the treaty ceded half of Mexico's territory to the United States for $15 million plus $3.25 million in claims of U.S. citizens against the Mexican government. The American acquisition of territory north of the Rio Grande in Texas, the granting of U.S. citizenships to Mexicans living in the newly acquired territories, the American acquisition of Alta California and New Mexico. It was ratified by the United States Senate 38 to 14 and faced a mounting opposition by Whigs who seized control of the House in the by-elections of 1846, and adamant expansionists who wanted all of Mexico. One of the reasons they really did not want all of Mexico is because they were Catholic. The Gathering Storm, 1848 to 1860. The California Gold Rush, Sutter's Mill. 7,000 Americans lived in California in 1848, and gold was discovered in January 1848 at Johann Augustus Sutter's Mill on a branch of the American River. News of the discovery soon spread and stimulated a great California gold rush. By the end of 1849, California's population had swollen by 100,000, hence the name 49ers. Mining life. Miners in California were largely single young men from a variety of racial, ethnic, and cultural backgrounds. Most came to California to strike it rich and return to their homes and former lives with a fortune. Few, however, were successful. Many miners followed rumors of new strikes, leading to tumultuous migratory lives. Placer mining was mines that used cheap metal pans, picks, and shovels to harvest gold flecks from the river and streams. But there was a great deal of violence. Miners in general were prone to suffering from disease and lived in violent, lawless towns. Within 6 months of arriving in California in 1849, one gold seeker in every 5 was dead. General store owners succeeded selling to miners. Hydraulic mining and hard rock mining would replace placer mining. But there was discrimination in the mining communities. About 20,000 Chinese moved to California to pursue mining, but many faced discrimination. Indians were killed and their land taken. Mexicans were driven off, and their titles to the land were ignored by the courts. California statehood. San Francisco was transformed from a small port to a bustling metropolis. When California requested admittance to the Union, New Mexico was also ready to enter, and both had forbidden slavery within their borders, even though they fell below the Missouri Compromise line. President Taylor pushed to have them added regardless of their slave status. California and New Mexico. President Polk failed to secure territorial organization for California and New Mexico because the issue of the status of slavery in the newly acquired territories. But the influx of settlers into California after the discovery of gold made the issue of territorial organization a pressing need. When Taylor assumed the presidency, he favored territories determining the question of slavery, not Congress, and informed the people of California and New Mexico not to wait for Congress to act on the issue before forming a government. A convention in Monterey, California, September through October 1849, adopted a constitution banning slavery, ratified by Californians in November. Taylor recommended admitting California immediately, threatening to maintain the Union against recent threats of disunion by Southerners, who immediately attacked his plan. In March 1850, California applied for statehood as the 31st state, which would upset the balance of free and slave states of 15 apiece. Clay, who had played a role in the Missouri Compromise, returned to the Senate just in time to use his skills to prevent the Union from tearing itself apart in 1850. Clay tried to package all the concerns of the free and slave states into 8 resolutions, hoping to settle the issues between the two factions. They were: first, California would become a free state. Second, New Mexico and Utah would become territories without slaves. Third, Texas's claim of land in New Mexico would not be recognized. 4, the federal government would compensate Texas by paying its pre-annexation debts. 5, slavery would continue in Washington, D.C. 6, the trading of slaves in Washington, D.C. would be prohibited. 7, an enforceable Fugitive Slave Act would be adopted. And 8, Congress would not be allowed to interfere with interstate slave trading. Then came the Great Debate. The Senate debates on these resolutions, the greatest in congressional history, marked the last meeting of the great triumvirate of Calhoun, Clay, and Webster. Clay appealed for mutual concessions and warned that secession was no remedy for Southern grievances. Too ill to speak, Calhoun's speech, read by Senator James M. Mason of Virginia, contained ways the Union could be saved. give the South equal rights in the acquired territories, halt agitation over the slavery question, and amend the Constitution to restore the substantive power of the South enjoyed before the balance of power was destroyed by the government. In essence, give each section veto power over congressional laws, his doctrine of concurrent majority. If the North was unwilling to grant this equilibrium, said Calhoun, let the states we both represent agree to separate in peace. And if the North refuses, we shall know what to do when reduce the question to submission all resistance. Daniel Webster's speech on March 7, 1850, speaking as an American in favor of the Union, not as a sectionalist, said, I wish to speak today, not as a Massachusetts man, nor as a Northern man, but as an American and a member of the Senate of the United States. Webster supported the resolution holding that slavery was excluded in the territories by virtue of soil and climate, and therefore it was not necessary for Congress to ban slavery in the territories. He urged a compromise and warned his Southern colleagues that a peaceful disunion was impossible. A political end became visible when President Taylor died and Millard Fillmore became president. Fillmore was willing to concede on issues that Taylor had not. So, quick review, the Compromise of 1850. California as a free state. Popular sovereignty in Utah and Mexico. They would decide on whether to have slavery or not. Ended the slave trade in the District of Columbia and a stricter fugitive slave law. Responses to the Fugitive Slave Act. As we see here, this 1851 notice warned free blacks about police and others who could easily kidnap and sell them back into slavery under the new Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act became the most controversial part of the Compromise of 1850 and threatened to tear the nation apart. It required the federal government and Northerners to return runaway slaves. Abolitionists condemned this portion of the Compromise of 1850 as immoral and urged Americans to break or ignore the law. Many moderate abolitionists became passionately opposed to the Fugitive Slave Act, especially when President Fillmore authorized the use of federal troops to enforce it. Reaction against the Fugitive Slave Act was strongest among free African Americans in the North, who responded to the Fugitive Slave Act by forming associations for protection and resistance. The League of Freedom and the Liberty Association were created to stop slaves from being captured. Frederick Douglass convinced the National Black Convention in 1853 to establish a national council, but unfortunately it failed. Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe in response to the Fugitive Slave Act. Uncle Tom's Cabin detailed the life of a fictional slave in the South and the struggles of a slave family. It became a bestseller and helped bring to light the plight of the slaves in a society that did its best to ignore it. Stowe's novel ignited a firestorm over slavery, moving many Northern whites to more active anti-slavery participation. Southerners condemned Uncle Tom's Cabin. By the time of the Civil War, it had sold more copies than any work of an American fiction ever. Northern blacks embraced the work as beneficial to aiding the plight of blacks. It emphasized Christian values as being opposed to the institution of slavery. Uncle Tom's Cabin succeeded because it presented real characters and not just abstract arguments. Although her book was influential, especially in the North, it was filled with many contemporary myths about blacks, saying that blacks were inferior, even free blacks. The most intelligent blacks were mulattoes. Her solution to the free black problem was Journey Back to Africa. The Kansas-Nebraska Crisis. With opening of markets in Asia, a quicker method of shipping goods from coast to coast was needed. As a result, Congress considered several proposals for a transcontinental railroad. Stephen A. Douglas, the Little Giant, promoted a path to the west with Chicago, located in his home state of Illinois, as the point of departure. His plan, which cut through the Louisiana Territory, provided an incentive to the South. and that the Missouri Compromise would be amended in that area, allowing each territory to choose whether to hold slaves by popular sovereignty. President Pierce forced the Native Americans to cede land for the railroad in 1853. Douglas sought congressional approval to set up a government in the Nebraska territories. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed in 1854. The bill broke the territory into two territories, Kansas and Nebraska. Douglas supported popular sovereignty. The law passed in 1854, creating the Kansas and Nebraska territories, but leaving the question of slavery open to residents, therefore repealing the Missouri Compromise. Northerners of all portage were outraged by the Kansas-Nebraska Act because the bill repealed the Missouri Compromise and showed the South's determination to spread slavery. They were also convinced that a slave power conspiracy was in control of the federal government. Douglas was criticized, and motives were attributed to him for suggesting that he courted Southern Democrats for a run at president. President Pierce supported the Kansas-Nebraska bill, which became law. However, he failed to effectively handle the territory and the problems of Kansas. Bleeding Kansas. Popular sovereignty was severely tested when Kansas was open to settlement because a non-intervention was now Congress's policy. Whoever controlled the territory government was vitally necessity, which provoked armed conflicts between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces. Northerners financed immigration to Kansas by many who favored no slavery. Southerners also sent pro-slavery supporters, especially from neighboring Missouri, a slave state. Border ruffians. In the Kansas territory, both pro and anti-slavery forces were poured into the country. Pro-slavery elements in the Kansas manipulated the status of the Kansas-Nebraska Act by arming border ruffians from Missouri who came in on election day to support slavery. Beecher's Bibles was the name given to a New England immigrant aid company that brought in Beecher's Bibles. They were actually cases marked Bibles, but inside they were guns. A gift from Henry Ward Beecher, a New York preacher and brother to the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe. The Topeka was a pro-slavery voters, a majority of them fraudulent, elected a pro-slavery legislature. Anti-slavery forces met in Topeka and formed a government outlawing slavery and petitioned the Congress for statehood. President Pierce denounced the measure and threw his support behind the pro-slavery government. The result of this was Bleeding Kansas. Sporadic violence erupted, leading journalists to call the conflict Bleeding Kansas. And it broke out in 1856, starting with a band of pro-slavery forces that sacked Lawrence, but no one was killed. In response, John Brown and 4 of his sons, armed with broadswords, hacked to death 5 pro-slavery settlers in Potawatomi Creek. The Dred Scott case. Dred Scott was born in Virginia, a household slave of Dr. John Emerson, an Army surgeon who was taken in 1834 from St. Louis, Missouri to Rock Island, Illinois, where slavery had been banned by the Ordinance of 1787, and later to Fort Snelling in Wisconsin Territory, where slavery had been prohibited by the 1820 Missouri Compromise. Scott remained on free soil during most of the 1834-1838 years. When Dr. Emerson died in 1843, his wife, Eliza Irene Sanford, remarried an abolitionist from Massachusetts and moved to New England, leaving her business affairs in the hands of her brother, John F. A. Sanford. Rather than free his wife's slaves, the abolitionists encouraged Scott to sue for his freedom to provide a Supreme Court test case, which might deal a blow to the institution of slavery. Scott and his wife Harriet sued for their freedom in the Missouri courts in 1846, holding the position that he had become free after living 5 years in free territory. A lower court ruled in favor of Scott, but in 1852, the state Supreme Court ruled against him in Scott v. Emerson, although in a previous ruling, the same court had ruled that a slave became free after having lived in free territory upon his return to Missouri. This was Rachel v. Walker in 1837, based on the principle once free, always free. In the case of Dred Scott v. Sanford, unfortunately, Scott's lawyers injected other issues into the case rather than just freedom, like Scott's ability to sue in a federal court and the issue of blacks' claim to be a U.S. citizen. The issue shifted to whether Scott had ever been free, not whether Missouri could keep him in slavery. It also challenged the constitutionality of the Missouri Compromise and the power of the Congress to limit slavery in the territories. The Supreme Court ruled against Scott 7-2 on March 6, 1857. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney dismissed Scott's case, and his opinion argued African Americans in the northern states were not citizens and so could not initiate a lawsuit. He also ruled that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional, and the Supreme Court ruled against Scott, saying that slaves have no rights, and declared that any law that said otherwise was illegal. The majority of the justices themselves owned slaves. By declaring the Missouri Compromise prohibition of slavery illegal, the Supreme Court justices declared an act of Congress unconstitutional for the first time since Marbury v. Madison had established judicial review in 1803. According to this ruling, slavery could not be limited by Congress or territorial governments, which threatened to extend slavery in all parts of the United States. This threatened one of the major goals of the Republican Party, limiting slavery's growth. Response to the Dred Scott case, free blacks in the North organized and protested the decision. The Republican Party gained more electoral support in northern states. It further divided the Democrats because Southerners celebrated the decision as a huge victory for pro-slavery forces. With the court's intrusion on the slave issue, many felt the compromise of slavery was now impossible, moving the nation irretrievably towards war. Lincoln-Douglas debates. The Lincoln-Douglas debates pitted the incumbent Democrat Senator Stephen A. Douglas against former Whig Congressman Abraham Lincoln. At first, Douglas refused to debate Lincoln, but Lincoln would follow Douglas and heckle him until he agreed to the debate. Lincoln was a popular politician in Illinois due to his down-to-home humor, his quick wit, his charismatic speaking style, and his firm stand that slavery should not spread to the territories. Lincoln gave his House Divided speech in Springfield when accepting the nomination for senator on June 16, 1858, when he said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free." The series of debates in 1858 Illinois senatorial campaign, during which Douglas and Lincoln staked out differing opinions on the issue of slavery in the territories. The debates were held throughout Illinois and highlighted the differences between the Democrats and Republicans, and North and South. Then came the Freeport Doctrine. This was the most memorable debate where Douglas formed his Freeport Doctrine. Lincoln asked Douglas how to reconcile popular sovereignty with the Scott decision. Asked Lincoln, "Can the people of a United States territory in any lawful way exclude slavery from its limits prior to the formation of a state constitution?" Now, if Douglas answered yes, he would be going against Dred Scott, thereby alienating many voters in Illinois and most voters in the South. If he answered no, he would alienate the other voters in Illinois and most voters in the North. Lincoln basically gave him one of those questions: no matter how he answers, is going to hurt him. Douglas replied that the people of the territory could exclude slavery by lawful means prior to the formation of a state constitution because he said slavery couldn't exist a day or an hour anywhere unless supported by local police regulations established by the local legislatures. His answer was not considered strong enough by Northerners and reminded Southerners that certain police powers were required to make slavery work. Southern senators would deprive Douglas a key Senate post and cost him support among Southern Democrats as well. These debates indicated the differences between Lincoln and Douglas. Lincoln regarded slavery as a moral, social, and political wrong, but rejected black equality. Douglas avoided the moral issue. The results, Lincoln won the popular vote in Illinois, but failed to carry the legislature 54-41, which at the time, that's what elected senators, which according to the U.S. Constitution. Douglas won the election, but Lincoln emerged in the national spotlight. John Brown's raid. John Brown had become a celebrity in New England and intellectual and anti-slavery circles for his anti-slavery efforts in Kansas. Brown was a native of Connecticut, and in 1859, Brown created a small army and attacked the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, hoping to trigger a slave uprising. Brown first collected arms at the Kennedy Farm in Maryland before crossing the Potomac, leading 18 men, including 5 slaves, to Harper's Ferry, Virginia. There they seized the federal arsenal and armory. They took some local citizens hostage and issued a call throughout the countryside for other slaves to join the rebellion. The first man that was killed, ironically, was a free black postal carrier. When no slaves answered the call to rebel after 2 days of battle, Brown and his survivors were taken prisoners by the U.S. Marines under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee. A treason trial would ensue from October 25th to December 2nd. Brown was indicted for treason against Virginia and criminal conspiracy to incite a slave insurrection and was tried at Charlestown, Virginia, convicted and hanged along with 4 of his band on the 16th and 2 others on 16 March 1860. The effects, Southerners blamed abolitionists and black Republicans for Brown's raid. Conservative Northerners deplored the raid. Abolitionists mourned Brown as a hero and martyr, and Southerners saw it as an example of what the North would do if given a chance. John Brown's raid raised the worst fears of Southerners. The state militias began to seriously now train in preparation for a future type of raids by abolitionists. The election of 1860. Democrats first met in Charleston, where they were divided. Southern Democrats favored William L. Yancey's platform to protect slavery in the territories. The non-Southern delegates supported Stephen A. Douglas for president, and a plan that pledged obedience to the Dred Scott decision. Douglas should have been the logical choice. However, he had turned off many Southerners with his Freeport doctrine, which suggested a legal way of evading the Dred Scott decision. His opposition to Kansas being admitted as a slave state on the Lecompton Constitution. So they're going to try to meet again in Baltimore. But however, with the split in the party, Northern Democrats would nominate Douglas, while Southern Democrats nominated John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky. The Republicans became the clear favorite in the presidential election of 1860 due to the Democratic split. Republicans chose a moderate with Abraham Lincoln and earned the Republican nomination for president by upsetting William Seward. The Constitutional Union Party, where Whigs from the Upper South nominated John Bell of Tennessee. It was a national party formed in 1860 mainly by the former Whigs that emphasized allegiance to the Union and strict enforcement of national legislation. A Wide Awakes group of red-shirted, black-caped young men who paraded through the city streets in the North, extolling the virtues of the Republican Party during the 1860 presidential election campaign. Dividing the national map. Reflecting the sectional nature of the campaign, 3 of the 4 candidates in 1860's presidential election tear the fabric of national unity. Lincoln and Douglas Shank at the north and west, and Breckinridge pulls at the south, while the 4th candidate, John Bell of the Constitutional Union Party, makes a futile attempt to try to glue the pieces back together. The results. Although many hoped that the multiplicity of candidates would force this election into the House of Representatives, Lincoln won a popular vote of 1,866,352 to Douglas's 1,375,157. Breckinridge received 847,953 votes, and Bell received 589,581 votes, making Lincoln, who did not carry a single Southern vote, that's because he wasn't even on any ballot, a majority. Lincoln carried 180 of the 303 electoral votes, 18 free states as the clear winner, despite Southern states' refusal to place his name on the ballot. Breckinridge came in second with 72 electoral votes, 11 slave states to Bell's 39. He won 3 border states to Douglas's 12. All he won was Missouri, and he got 3 electoral votes from New Jersey. Had a fusion ticket been formed with Lincoln's opposition, it would have changed the outcome in only 3 states, New Jersey, California, and Oregon, a total of 11 electoral votes, and would not have affected the outcome of the election. The response in the South. Where 10 years earlier Robert Barnwell Rhett had failed at the Nashville Convention, he and his supporters were now ready for the desperate alternative of secession by separate state action. The South Carolina legislature, which was still in session since choosing presidential electors, called for a state convention to consider secession. In Charleston on December 20th, 1860, they voted unanimously to leave the Union. The Organization of Confederate States of America met on February 4, 1861 in Montgomery, Alabama. 6 states, with Texas coming later, met in Montgomery to form a government. Howell Cobb was the chair of 50 delegates. They drafted a provisional constitution and named their country the Confederate States of America. They elected Jefferson Davis as provisional president and Alexander Stephens as provisional vice president. The delegates rejected the fire eaters and wanted moderates for the new government, who they saw as their George Washington and John Adams.